Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitaba wa lam yaj'al lahu 'iwaja. The subject that I want to talk about tonight is, I know it might sound like a sort of this pie in the sky subject, but it's actually an important subject, very important subject, and it's an interesting subject, and I hope that you will also find it to be an interesting subject. And the subject involves the Qur'an, which obviously we believe has come directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, conveyed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the angel Gabriel over a 23-year period. This belief of ours is different from the Christians. Christians believe in the Bible, and they don't view the Bible as the literal word of God. They view the Bible as the inspired word of God, meaning that, people wrote it according to their understanding. They wrote out the text according to their understanding, using their own language and their own historical recollections. But they say God inspired it. It's not the same thing as saying that God said it. They say that God only inspired it. So for us, the Qur'an, the language that the Qur'an uses, the format that it's in, everything in it is from Allah. And so then, what's the Qur'an for? What is the purpose or the function of the Qur'an? You ever notice that sometimes we treat it as a set of magic formulas? If you remember Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, in that story, Ali Baba, where they go to the cave and they say, "Open, O sesame," and the cave opens. Iftah, iftah ya simsim. You know the story. Iftah, iftah ya simsim. So sometimes we treat the Qur'an like that. More often than that, we tend to use the Qur'an, just to look up a sentence or a verse or a text that supports what we're already going to do, or to support what we already believe, or whatever thing that we have planned. So this is how we, really use the Qur'an. But is that really what the Qur'an is for? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us some of the reasons that the Qur'an has come. One of the most important verses in it, I'm only going to quote part of it. It says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It says, لِتُبَشِّرَ بِهِ الْمُتَّقِينَ وَتُنْذِرَ بِهِ قَوْمًا لُبْدًا. He says that the job of the Qur'an, Allah is telling the Prophet, to deliver good news to those with taqwa. This is number one. And for you to deliver warning to a hostile people. This is chapter, it's a good way to remember it. Chapter 1990, verse 97. The year 1997 is a good way to remember where it is. So, in this particular ayah, the Surah Al-Maryam, verse 97, this particular ayah, scholars have used this to summarize how the Qur'an should be approached. And I think it's a good way to understand the purpose of the Qur'an. So it begins by saying, لِتُبَشَّرَ بِهِ الْمُتَّقِينَ, to give good news to those with taqwa. Bihi, they give them good news, bihi, they give them good news with it, with the Qur'an. So that shows us that the purpose of the Qur'an is not to act as a set of magic formulas, but rather is to be a confidence booster. Do you take energy drinks like those what do you call those energy drinks?
5-hour energy.
5-hour energy. Those, you don't take those? Okay, that's good. But nonetheless, the Quran functions like that as an iman booster. And sometimes it functions, not sometimes, but very often, it functions as a text which tells us actually what to do and tells us what actually not to do. It encourages us towards taqwa. And the most important function, when we consider that today's world is filled with distractions, wherein God, in quotation marks, wherein God is seen as abnormal. So the ayah continues, وَتُنذِرَ بِهِ قَوْمَ لُقْدًا, to deliver warning, bihi again, to deliver warning with it to a people who are hostile. Again, chapter 19, verse 97. So the great commentator Tabari, he understands this term ludda, it's translated as hostile. He understands this term ludda as referring to people who are seemingly immune to truth, meaning that they have a blindness. And this is actually very interesting, very important. Yet God says that such people should be warned, even though we think they shouldn't be warned, or we think that it's not going to matter. God says that such people should be warned, and that the Quran functions as a warning to them. And that statement, chapter 1997, that statement shows us the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's use a real story, a real example. Recall the story of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu.
Can you come here?
Sure.
Can you come here?
Sure. It's good? Okay. Okay, so recall the story of Umar. This was a person, this is a good example of this verse in action. Because this was a person who actually wanted to kill the Prophet. He had such a hatred of Islam that he says, I'm going to kill Muhammad. And on his way, as the story goes, on his way to kill Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, someone tells him, says, why are you going to kill him? Fix the problems in your own family. Your sister is following this guy. Her husband is following this guy, Muhammad. Go to his house, go to your family's house, deal with the stuff in your own house. And he goes there and he encounters them reading the Qur'an. He hears the recitation of the Qur'an, and it immediately changed him. Really, it immediately changed him. And I'm skipping some important details of the story, but it immediately changed him. So what the theme of tonight's discussion is about taking steps towards a new life through the Qur'an, through the study of the Qur'an, or maybe you can put it another way, having a methodology for studying the Qur'an. And in a sense, what we want to do is to maximize the opportunities to be blessed in the same way that Umar was blessed. And again, he was impacted by just hearing very short verses. He heard the verses from Surah Taha, Surah number 20. And one of the reports actually suggests it wasn't Taha, but rather it was Surah Al-Hadid, Surah number 57. But whatever surah, it impacted him. And it wasn't simply a personal impact. The Qur'an transformed him. This is an early companion of the Prophet who originally wanted to kill the Prophet. It transformed his life to a point where later on in his own life, he became the leader of the Muslims. You know, can you imagine that? That he originally wanted to kill Rasulullah, and then he became the most devoted follower of Rasulullah to the point where he became the leader of Rasulullah's followers after the Rasul's death. And what happened under him, Sayyidina Umar? What happened after him in his leadership is that the Muslim community expanded. It had a very strong growth in his time. Jerusalem came under Muslim rule. The religion of Islam entered into Iran, which was a great power in those days. And this person, Umar radiallahu anh, was famous for his firm approach to justice. And there's only two evidences I want to share. Evidence number one, and perhaps these evidences are well known, but evidence number one is that during his time there was a famine, and he suspended the punishment for theft. Why did he suspend the punishment for theft? Because the person who was stealing is stealing, to support his family, to get food for his family in a time of famine. He says this would not be justice to punish somebody for trying to provide for his family. The second example of what Islam did to him personally and how it became manifest later is, again, Jerusalem fell. Jerusalem came under the Muslim rule, and the people of Jerusalem says, "We want you to come." Umar, is the leader of the Muslims. We want you to come. So he comes to Jerusalem, and he is sort of taking a tour of the place with the patriarch of Jerusalem, and this is at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Kanisa al-Qiyamah, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And while he's there, this is perhaps the holiest places in Christendom. So while he's there, the time for prayer comes. Heard this story before? The time for the prayer comes, and the patriarch, he was very kind. He says, pray, offer your prayer here in the church. And Umar said no. Why did he say no? He said no. He says, if I pray now, future generations of Muslims are going to use that as an excuse to take away the church and turn it into a masjid. So instead, Allah be pleased with him, he prayed outside. And his thought was prophetic, because later on, future generations of Muslims made a masjid called Masjid Umar outside of the church grounds. Where he prayed, the Muslims made a masjid there. So all of this was a result of one guy who was angry, who we may describe as an Islamophobe. All this things that happens was a result of this one guy hearing a few words of the Qur'an, and him being impacted by the words of the Qur'an, and the impact of him hearing those words are still being felt to this day by countless generations and countless peoples. In ways small and great, personal and collectively, the Qur'an has this power of causing growth. And Allah puts us a particular analogy, a method, an analogy. And he talks about, this is in Surah Ibrahim, he talks about a productive tree. I've heard this before. He talks about a productive tree that is firmly rooted. فِرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. Its branches are reaching forth to the sky, bringing forth fruit at all times and seasons. وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالَ لِلنَّاسِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَذَكَّرُونَ. So now I want to go into the core of this presentation. These words have been sort of introduction to the core of what I want to share. And I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about tajweed or the art of reciting the Qur'an in a nice way. I'm not talking about becoming hafiz, a memorizer of the Qur'an. Those things are important. Those things brings forth their own blessings and their own spiritual nourishment. But my focus is not on those. My focus is on some other area. And that is to study in a manner that brings forth, or in a fashion that brings forth a new life. I want to share some tips that have worked for me personally, and I will share some tips from others, but I want to first share some tips that have worked for me. So this is a bit personal. Tip number 1 is to study the Quran slowly. You can't be fast. You have to do it slowly. I mean, this is actually common sense if you think about it, because the way it came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it didn't come to him all at once. It came to him slowly over a period of 2 decades. So if we can read some of it daily, I mean, that's ideal. But you know, life gets busy, and you know, we have all things going on. There are many Muslims who only read the Quran in Ramadan, and so because they only read it in Ramadan, they say they're going to read the whole thing. They're going to read the whole thing totally in the month of Ramadan. And the Muslim Journal is a newspaper that all of you know. The Muslim Journal, every year, every Ramadan, they publish it's called a Quran reading schedule. So every day they have in there Juz 1, Juz 2. You know, they make it so that the reader can read the whole Quran through the month. And it does have its benefits, because for much of my life, I followed this practice. It has its benefits, but it can also have its pitfalls. You know, especially if you're working, you have kids, you have a life, and you're trying to read all this stuff, and you're fasting, and you got this and you got that, and then you go to the masjid where the imam is also going to read a whole juz of every day in the prayer. So you know, it can have its blessings, also has its pitfalls. So for me, what works, this is the first tip. For me, what works is, and this is my suggestion, is maybe 10 verses. That's it. 10 verses. Maybe it's 10 verses a day. Maybe when you wake up, before you start your day, going to work and you know, dealing with the kids and all that, or before going to sleep. Just 10 verses. That's easy. That should be easy. Just 10 verses. The second tip is, when you read these 10 verses, is to have a notebook handy. This is things that, again, this is my own tips, is to have a notebook handy. Because when you read these 10 verses, undoubtedly, you will come across an ayah, a statement, a surah, a phrase, an expression, an idea, a concept that you may become interested in, or that you may have a question about. an ayah or a verse that touches your heart for whatever reason, that you seem like it's impacting you right at that moment for whatever reason. So having a notebook, you come across such an ayah, write it down. And record your own thoughts and your own observations about with that ayah. Like, what is it about that ayah that's affecting you personally? Also, writing it down helps you to memorize it. Really, writing down the ayah, the text that you're reading, helps you memorize it. And this does not work with recording on your tablet or recording on your cell phone. It doesn't work that way. As much as you try, even you remember something from the internet, after about a day or two, you forget it all. So it should be, this is my advice at least, it should be written down. It helps you memorize it. It helps you to understand it. And it even helps you to apply it. And if you're somebody who likes to read, or likes to study in general, if that's your personality, if that's your interest, and if you have access to, let's say, books of tafsir, of Quranic commentary, books of hadith and fiqh and history and dictionaries and all those resources, if you have access to those resources, when you come across these verses, you can consult these other sources and write it all down. Write down the conclusions that you have reached. Write down the observations that has been made by these other sources. And it's also a good idea to ask people. Let's say you have a question about a verse, or you don't understand a particular text. The same with the hadith of the Prophet. It's a good idea to ask people whose knowledge and whose understanding you trust. Ask a source that you trust. Let me share this. Let me share this story. I like to share this story. Imam Shafi'i. There's a story that says that he was once having an argument with. Let me rephrase it. An atheist, mulhid, came to him, and he says, "Is it true that the Qur'an contains all things?" Imam says, "Yes." He says, "Okay. Where does it say in the Qur'an how to bake bread?" Imam doesn't know the answer to that question. He says, I'm gonna find it for you. I'm gonna let you know. So after some time, the atheist comes back to Imam. He says, "Well, where does it tell you how to bake bread?" So he quotes the ayah, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. The meaning is, ask those who know if you don't know. So what did he do? So the Imam, he went to a baker, somebody whose job it is to bake bread, and he tells the baker tells him the process of baking bread, and he shares that process with the fellow, with the questioner. See, the Quran says everything. So, okay, the second. The third tip. I know this is what I'm going to say might sound a bit odd, but I'm going to share it because I think it's important. The goal of the Qur'an is not specifically to give a person arguments on theology or arguments on history. The Qur'an that's not its main job. And what I mean by that is that theologically speaking, the doctrines of Islam are very clear. Yes, there are differences among Muslims. There have been differences among Muslims, and there will always be differences among Muslims. But the Muslim groupings have the same God, the same scripture, the same prayers, the same pillars of faith, the same articles of faith. So they don't really differ about. And the reason for that is that the Qur'an, sort of states matter-of-factly and then leaves it alone. because its focus isn't on necessarily on theology. It is not necessarily on history either. So Muslim-Christian polemics, we're arguing about different things. The Bible says this, and Christians say that, and the Qur'an says this, and Muslims say that. The Qur'an doesn't spend a lot of time, to be honest with you. It says, let me give a quick example. It says, وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. That Jesus was neither crucified, nor was he killed, but it was made to appear to be the case. But it doesn't tell you any more details than that. In other words, its focus is not on just refuting the Christian tradition about that subject. That's not its focus. Maybe we have our people who come up along and explain this and that, but the Quran's focus is not on trying to completely destroy another group's ideas. That's not its focus. It just says matter-of-factly, وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. So, okay, if the Quran isn't for just telling you a theological argument or telling you a historical argument, what is the Quran for? ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. That the Quran is guidance, huda lil muttaqin, that is guidance for those with taqwa. And it's also given as a guide to clean up the internal messes that we have. It's given for tazkiyat an-nafs. It's given for as a tool to help clean up the nafs. The most beautiful ayah I found that explains that. It says, أَفَلَا يَتَتَبِعُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not contemplate upon the Quran? Or are their hearts locked up? That's what Allah says. So tadabbur, the term that comes from that verb, tadabbur, is supposed to not only be some sort of intellectual goal. It is an exercise in spiritual health. The Quran, in a sense, it removes rust from the hearts. I really believe that the Quran removes rust from the hearts. The fourth observation, and this is again a little controversial, but I'm going to explain what I mean. A person can gain insight into the Quran by reading the translation, Yusuf Ali translation or whatever translation. However, there's a problem. It's like even if you read the Quran just in English, the problem is that it's like only getting a sip of the ocean. That's the problem. Or I shouldn't say problem, that's just the reality. I mean, there's no way getting around it. Yes, you can gain from just reading the translation. You can perhaps gain more than others. But it's going to be like just taking a small sip from the ocean. Now, the Quran was not revealed in English. It wasn't revealed in Turkish. It wasn't revealed in Spanish. It was revealed in Arabic. And if you are a person who is serious about the deen in general and about the Quran in particular, then knowledge of Arabic is vital. إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. Knowledge of Arabic is vital. And that doesn't mean that every single person has to become Sibawi or Taha Hussein, and the two Egyptians, Taha Hussein or Mutanabbi or something. No, you don't have to become like that. The majority of Muslims in the world are not Arab. The majority of us are not Arab. Majority of Muslims in the world do not speak the Arabic language. However, the majority of Muslims can read the Arabic language because it has become the traditional education system throughout the Muslim world is to learn at least enough Arabic to be able to open up the book and to recite it, to read it in the language in which it was revealed. The fifth tip is, and again, I'm sharing things that this is also personal. And this is also perhaps controversial. The verses or the sentences or the surahs that you read and that touch you, strive to memorize them in Arabic as well as the translation. And the best way to do that is if you have a teacher, to someone who can correct your pronunciation and all of that. But if you don't have a teacher, the next best thing to do to memorize the verses that touch you is to read the text in your prayer. So, for example, I don't know. I'm gonna pick one. Atiq, do you have a favorite verse that you can think of?
Off the top of my head, I can't really think.
Okay. Anyone else have a favorite verse or a favorite? Pardon? Okay, everyone is shy tonight. But let's say that you read a particular verse in English, and it really touches you. It really inspires you for whatever reason, and you tell yourself, "I want to memorize this verse." Well, a good way to do so is to use it in your salat. So, if you
verse 87, Allah.
Surah Al-A'la. Do you know the surah by heart?
In English.
In English. Okay. So the best, though, my advice will apply then. So when you pray, this is by yourself, by the way. when you do the Maghrib prayer or the Fajr prayer or the Isha prayer, hold up the Mus'haf, the Qur'an, and recite that particular verse or the particular surah, the particular chapter. After you do it for about a week or two, you'll be able to you'll commit it to memory.
I said for tahajjud prayer.
Tahajjud prayer is even better.
Yeah.
It's even better.
I can read it in Arabic, but I don't understand all the words.
What I'm saying is that since you know it, using this example, since you know it in English, if you do it line by line, you should be able. It's Surah Al-A'la. I'm getting a little distracted here, but Surah Al-A'la is this kind of a long, medium length surah. And
But
since
I do know. I can say it by heart.
oh, you can in Arabic.
No, not
In English. What I'm saying is you already know it in English,
Right.
then I'm saying, like, add the Arabic to that. That's what I'm saying. Is since you already know it in English, is to try to know it in Arabic. And I'm not saying to read it in English in your salat. I'm not saying that. And so when that kind of process will, after about a week or two of doing that in your tahajjud prayer or your maghrib prayer or your Isha prayer or your morning prayer, that kind of process will allow you to memorize it, and it becomes a part of you. You mentioned this surah for a certain reason, because it becomes a part of you. So the Quran will become your property. Next thing I want to share is, this is from one of the great scholars of Islam, Imam Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali. And I think all of you here know or heard of him. He's a great spiritualist of the Muslim tradition, the Islamic tradition. And in his book, it's called The Revival of Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulum ad-Din. He has what he calls outward rules for reading the Qur'an and inward rules for reading the Qur'an. And so this is I want to share this, and if you're interested in writing this down or recording it in some way, then this will be a good time to do that. So I'm summarizing his rules, how to read the Qur'an. First rule, he says, is you must read it respectfully. So you can't be, watching TV and texting and, like just laying in bed like that. He says that you have to read the Qur'an respectfully. So he says, be in wudu, have wudu before reading it. And he even says to face the Qibla when you're reading it. Now, I admit that there's no verse which says that. There's no hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, that says that you have to have wudu when reading the Qur'an. But nonetheless, it is the ijma', it is the agreement of all of the schools of thought in the Sunni Islam, and perhaps in Shia, I don't know, perhaps in the Shia Islam as well.
How about لا يمسه إلا الطهور?
I'll talk about that. That's a good point. I will talk about that in a moment. So, even though there's no ayah, and he's shared an ayah, but we'll address it a little later on. Even though there's no ayah or hadith which tells us that you must have wudu when reading it, it's the agreement of the Muslims that you have wudu, because it acts as a mental preparation. Just like the wudu before prayer, it acts as a mental preparation. When you go for a job interview, you don't go to the job interview in your pajamas. Wake up, you had all the the bad hair and smelling all funky and all of that. You don't do that. What do? You take a shower. You wake up. You have an interview at 8 in the morning. You wake up early. You take a shower. You groom yourself. You make yourself look nice, because it's preparing you for this thing that you find to be important. And the Qur'an is similar, isn't it? Or no, it's better than that, because the Qur'an is from Allah. So it deserves some respect. And let me share this. This is not part of the notes. Some people I notice in the masjids, they'll put the Qur'an on the floor and they read it, and that bugs the hell out of me. I gotta tell you, when I see that, it bothers me to see people who put the Qur'an on the floor and they read it. And I don't, books in general, but particularly the Book of Allah, it really bothers me. Okay, second rule that the Imam Al-Ghazali mentions, rahmatullahi alayhi, he says, in the same rule I mentioned in the beginning, he says the idea of it earlier, he says to read the Qur'an slowly. Don't read it fast, read it slowly. Third rule he mentions, we're almost finished. The third rule he mentions is, let what you read of the Book of Allah, he says, let what you read have an emotional impact. So he says it's okay to cry. He says it's actually necessary to cry. When you come across something that has impact, it's necessary to cry. And and it's necessary to cry when it's appropriate. And what better place than it can be with the Book of Allah? Rule number 4 he mentions, when reading verses that talk about punishment from God, then you should make dua to Allah right then for protection from that punishment. And he says, similarly, when you read verses about mercy from God, that you should make dua for that mercy from God right away. Fifth one, which I think is really interesting, is he says, this is a rule he gives. This is one of his rules. He says to be cognizant of others. And so Imam Ghazzali gives an example. Let's say you're in the masjid and you're reciting, you have the Qur'an, you're reciting it very loudly, and you notice another person praying. He says you should change your recitation to a low recitation. And so the reason for that is because your recitation may disturb the person praying. And I saw a video on the internet just last week, and it was in Medina, the Prophet's masjid in Medina, that there was a group of people in the masjid, and they had a qari among them, and he was reciting a surah. I think it was Surah Al-A'la, actually. I think so. He was reciting it very loud. You know, in the way of Abdul Basit. You know, he's reciting very long. He's reciting 3 times the same sentence 3 times. And you know, the police come along, and they basically, like, you know, forcefully, or not to say forcefully, but they firmly make him stop. And so someone made a video of that. But to me, it makes sense. You know, there are so many people, they're praying and they're reading and they're doing this and that. And so the idea is we shouldn't disturb others with our recitation. Now, the flip side of that, if I can use that expression, the flip side of that is you can and are encouraged to recite the Qur'an in a loud way, particularly to ward off Satan, to ward off the influences of Satan. And I was trying to think of a way to explain this concept when I studied this concept. Let's say, and this is maybe a bad example, but I'll share it anyway. You know, you're in your house, and it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and your neighbor is playing some music. Now, maybe it's jazz, whatever the music is. Your neighbor is playing music. And, you know, it's not bothering you at 2 o'clock. It's not bothering you. You might actually be enjoying the music. But, you know, if it's at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not enjoying that. You know, you're like, oh, where's my gun? And I want to shoot him. That's how your feeling's gonna be. So if you recite the Quran or listen to the Quran loudly in the daytime, it could actually help people. You know, it could help them. You know, the people who are in the listening range. But don't be in a situation to disturb people with it, is my point. You know, like people like driving down the street blasting their music. You know, they have the sound system in their car. I actually seen a sound system on a bike once, a bicycle. You know, you see the neighborhood where I live. You know, there's actually a sound system on a bicycle. So don't seek to disturb people with it. The 6th rule he gives, these are called the outward rules. The 6th rule he gives is read it in a pleasant voice, and this is tajweed. You know, to read it in a way that's nice and pleasant, and you know, something which stirs the soul. Don't read it like you're reading a newspaper. Again, we're almost finished. Now he has the inward rules, which is really fascinating. Rule number 1 is to have awareness that you're reading the words of Allah. You're not reading a newspaper. You're not reading someone else's thoughts. You're not reading a text message. You're not reading our president's speeches. You're reading the words of Allah. So you be cognizant that you're reading the words of Allah. The 2nd rule he mentions he calls it inward rules. He says, seek to cleanse the soul before reading it. So he says, just as you have, you know, the ijma is that you have wudu before reading it. He said there should be a wudu of the soul. That's what he says. There should be a wudu of the soul. So cleanse the soul before reading it. The third tip he mentions is if you're reading, and this is really interesting, if you're reading in a distracted way, you know, you're reading it like this, and then you get a phone call over here, and then you're watching TV over there, and you play with the kids over there. If you're reading it in a distracted way, he says that this reading is invalid. That you have to repeat that reading. And it's interesting because the same Imam Ghazzali says that prayer done in a rushed way, he says this prayer is batila. This prayer is invalid and it must be repeated. So just as, I don't know if I should, like we were praying Maghrib earlier and a little fellow distracted us. He's trying to say distracted us a little bit. We didn't move. But, he's still there in the periphery, right? It was our little fellow. Imam Ghazali says that if you pray in a distracted way, he says that prayer has to be repeated. It's a minority opinion, but that's an opinion that he has. It's a very interesting opinion. So when he says that the Qur'an should be read without distraction, I think what he means by that is that I think he's talking about when you're reading the Qur'an as an act of worship, ta'abudi, as an act of worship. So in Friday, the Prophet said what did he say to read on Fridays? Okay, yeah. So you're reading it. You're not really reading it as an intellectual exercise or to learn something. You're reading it as an act of worship. That particular thing you're doing it as an act of worship. So the Imam here says that you should read in a non-distracted way, and if you do read in a distracted way, then that reading has to be repeated. The fourth thing he mentions is meditate upon the meaning of each word that you read. The fifth thing he mentions is one's internal state should be affected by its reading. So if you read something about hell, you should be fearful. This is what he says. You should be fearful. And you should be joyful if you're reading something about paradise. And the sixth thing that he mentions, this is the last thing that I'm going to share, is one should listen to the Qur'an as if it is God directly speaking to you. The Imam mentions an unnamed person. In this book, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, he often will reference, he won't say the name, he'll say Fulan, so-and-so said XYZ. He'll often do that in his book. And he shares this unnamed source of his. He makes this statement: I used to read the Qur'an but did not receive its sweetness until I suppose I was hearing it from the Prophet. He says, I went more deeply than that. Imagine that I was hearing it from Angel Gabriel. He says, I went further than that until I reached the greatest stage. Now I read it as though I am hearing it from Allah without any intermediary, and I obtain a pleasure that I never felt before. This is the source, this is the statement of his. So what we gain from this is that the Quran is very important. It's unlike any other book, and it deserves as much attention as we can give it. Let me pause and answer Brother Abdul Hamid's question. He was talking about this ayah is surah number 56, verse number 79. La yamassuhu illa mutahharun. It says that the meaning of it, translation of it, is none touched it except those who are purified. Now, let me share the context, and you will see that the meaning is not what people say. The context begins here. I have to say this in Arabic. Innahu la Qur'anun Kareem, number 1. Fi kitab maknoon, number 2. La yamassuhu illa mutahharun, number 3. تنزيل من رب العالمين. Number 4. أفا بحديث أنتم مدهنون. Number 5. وتجعلون رزقكم أنكم تكذبون. Number 6. So the context of it is not about the wudu. The context of it, I'll give the translation now. But the context of it is, let me give the whole translation. He says, indeed it is a noble recitation in a guarded text, guarded scripture. None touch it except those who are purified. Meaning that it's a spiritual thing. That the people who don't have sincerity, they're not going to benefit from the scripture. You know, it doesn't matter how much Arabic they know. It doesn't matter how educated they are. If they don't have goodness in their hearts, and they don't have taqwa, then it's not going to work for them. So the meaning of it is not about tahara in the physical way. The meaning of it is a spiritual meaning, not necessarily the physical meaning. But even with that said, it's still the ijma' of the Muslims that you have wudu. And so they derive it really through analogy. They derive this rule from analogy, and the Muslims have, by and large, they have agreed to this. So a Muslim, a person who throws the Qur'an on the floor, like deliberately, not as an accident, like, you know, he throws the Qur'an on the floor. This technically be an act of kufr, even though the Qur'an doesn't say, wa alaikum salam, even though the Qur'an doesn't say, don't throw it on the floor, don't toss it, but we see this as disrespect to the Book of Allah. Even though there's no text that says it, you know, we recognize that it's disrespect to the Book of Allah, and this will be considered an act of kufr, even though no text says that. Any other questions or comments, sir? Yes.
Well, it's not really gonna say that because Quran was revealed as a book.
Yeah. That's right.
And later compiled as a book.
Yeah.
Years later, like way after Pakistan.
Yeah.
So you have to take that into account. They were talking about it because it's supposed to be a book. It's referred to as a book in the Quran, but it wasn't a book until later on.
You know, perhaps a way of putting it is that it wasn't a finished book. You know,
written down, but it was not collected as one holy book till the days of Osman.
yeah,
That's like 13 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
yeah.
But it was written scattered here and there in some kind of material you can write on.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean the Arabs they weren't writers, they were poets. So they recited it to each other and memorized it.
Yeah. But I mean, there are reports of people having their own individual masahif, and what happened is if you study ulum tafsir or ulum al-Qur'an, the sciences of the Qur'an, then they talk about these things in detail. So among the things that happened in the early days is that people had their own individual copies. And did you know how a lot of Americans, they have Bibles and they write their own notes? They write their, the Protestant Christianity encourages that. You know, the NIV Bible I have, like the back of it has about 10 pages where you can write your own notes. So people were writing the same thing with their individual Quran. They were writing their own du'as. They were writing their own comments. And sometimes they were writing in their own lahja. So the word hatta is written as ata. A lot of words, a lot of expressions like that. Was so. What happened is actually a fascinating history, is that non-Arabs started to embrace Islam, and even among the Arabs themselves, they have different dialects and things like that, but particularly non-Arabs. And so at that time, the language, Arabic language was written without vowels. Fatha, kasra, damma. They didn't have it. So a person could read, let's say for example, 3 letters, ka, ta, ba. Okay, kataba has a meaning, but kutiba also has a meaning. It's a different meaning. So if you don't know, then you might end up changing the meaning of the words, changing of the text. So it was decided. They said, look, we gotta get rid of all these other individual musahif, and we have one united mushaf. They call it Imam Mushaf actually, and this mushaf is the Uthmani mushaf. And so the language of it is the Prophet's language, the Qurayshi language, not the language of this tribe or that tribe. Even though a lot of that is still preserved in other books, but we recite the Qur'an today, not minal jinnati wan nas, minal jinnati wan nas, not jinnati wan nas. I mean, go please.
So that's where the diacritical marks.
The diacritical marks came much later. As a actual, like in today's I think it was Marwan ibn Abdul Aziz. I can't remember who now. Hajjaj. I can't remember which ruler now. But as an organized thing, the diacritical marks came later. And I can't remember exactly when. I'm trying to remember, but I can't really recall which. But it was a particular ruler, which under his reign introduced the Fatha Kasra Damma system.
I believe in the days of Uthman.
No, because in the days of Uthman there was no vowel marks, nor were there any dots. No, the nukta. There was no nukta.
It was collected in one book in the days of Uthman.
Yes. But the system, like the way we read Arabic today, yeah, exactly. So, but like the vowel marks, fatha, kasra, damma, and even the system we have of dots, these also came later on, as a way to prevent people, particularly non-Arabs, from reading the Qur'an incorrectly, because you can read the Qur'an incorrectly if you're not careful. So the vowel marks came later, and it's actually a miracle of Islam that all of that, and the Arabs were illiterate society, illiterate in the sense that there wasn't like high education like the Persians and the Egyptians and the other society, the Romans, the other societies that surrounded them. So the main way the Qur'an was preserved is first of all through memory. They weren't lazy like we are. They memorized the text. They use it in their prayers, and even the Muslims with their differences, they have the inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr wa inna lahu hafizun. Allah who sent down this reminder, this Qur'an, this reminder, and there's Allah who preserves it. So the good evidence for that is that in the early days you had the Sunni Shia conflict. The Uthman was assassinated, and Ali became the Khalifa, and it was all kinds of war that happened between the Muslims, unfortunately, which we are still suffering the results of today. But no one ever said that the Shia didn't say, "Oh, Uthman, he created his own Qur'an." No, they didn't say that. They disagree about tafsir, but not about text. But the text, they have to say, this is a good evidence for the historicity of the Qur'an, is that the Sunni and the Shia have the same text. In fact, among the Shia polemicists, they say that, they say, look, one guy I heard one of their imams, he says, look, my personal Qur'an is printed in Saudi Arabia, not in Iran, not in Iraq or Lebanon or the Shia printing houses. My personal Qur'an is printed in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran are enemies, but they have the same. They disagree about a lot of stuff, but they have the same text. Same text.
Basically, it's about transition after the prophet.
You mean like why did the fitna happen after the prophet?
Right.